The basement bar thrummed with life on a late evening, its low ceiling trapping cigarette smoke and the clink of glassware beneath buzzing neon signs. Sophie, a 22-year-old art student with tousled blonde hair and a defiant spark, stood poised with a dart, her slim frame taut. Mark, a 45-year-old mechanic, leaned against the wall, his rugged jaw shadowed by stubble, hands tucked into a faded jacket. The air carried the tang of spilled beer and the jukebox's hum, a gritty urban pulse matching their tension. Strangers linked by a friend. Their banter flowed easy until Sophie's throw wobbled, and Mark stepped in, his hand grazing her hip to adjust her stance. The heat seared through her thin shirt, her pulse jumping as his gray eyes met hers, igniting a current that fractured their casual ease. Her next dart sank closer to the bullseye, and Mark's lips twitched in approval. His scent, leather and oil, lingering as he stepped back. Sophie tossed her hair, masking the jolt with a grin, but his touch replayed in her mind, unbidden. The game tightened, each throw a quiet escalation. She reached past him for a dart, her shoulder brushing his chest, the solid warmth sparking a flush across her ribs. He tilted his head, smirking. "You're off tonight, kid," he teased, his rasp sinking into her, stirring a restless pull. Her throw landed sharp, and she shot him a daring look, catching him tracing her jaw with a hunger he didn't voice. He shifted closer, their arms grazing, the contact a silent agreement forming under the flickering lights. Their friend Jake, sprawled nearby with a beer, whooped as Sophie lined up again. "Finally, I thought you'd choke all night," he slurred, waving the bottle. Mark's boot scuffed the floor as he leaned in, his elbow brushing her ribs. His dart hit dead center, and his smirk deepened, her defiance mirrored in his stare. Jake's laugh cut through again. "Losers gotta pay up big. Make it wild," he called, tossing a dart that skimmed the board. Sophie's pulse surged, her eyes locking with Mark's. "Fine, if I lose, you name it," she said, bold despite the thudding in her chest. His jaw tightened, a dark glint flashing, and the bar's clamor dulled as her next throw veered wide. Mark's hand settled on her lower back, guiding her past Jake's cheer toward the shadowed corner. His fingers a warm claim that tilted her world. The dim edge swallowed them, the neon fading to a pulse against brick. Mark turned her to face him, his rough hand slipping under her jacket to skim her waist, the touch burning through her. "You lost? Ready to settle?" he asked, husky and low. Sophie's chest tightened, but she tugged his shirt up, revealing taut skin, her nails grazing lightly. "Depends what you're taking," she teased, his grip hardening as he pulled her flush against him. The age gap sharpened the thrill. Their bodies pressed tight, the stranger's line crumbling as the bar's hum became a distant echo, daring them to cross it fully. The bar's shadowed corner pulsed with a muted rhythm, the neon's faint glow seeping through the haze to paint streaks of color across the brick wall. Sophie stood pinned between Mark and the cool, rough surface, the heat of his body a stark contrast that sent her pulse racing. His hand lingered under her jacket, fingers splayed against her waist, the callous rough texture grazing her skin through her shirt. The air carried the sour edge of beer and the faint crackle of the jukebox. But here, in this pocket of dimness, it was his scent, leather, oil, a hint of sweat that wrapped around her, grounding and dizzying all at once. His gray eyes held hers, steady but alight, with something raw, and the world beyond them blurred into irrelevance. Mark leaned closer, his breath brushing her cheek as he spoke. voice low and gravelly. You lost? Time to pay up? The words sank into her, a challenge she met with a tilt of her chin, her fingers tugging harder at his shirt. The fabric bunched, exposing more of his torso, taut, weathered, marked by faint scars, and she dragged her nails lightly across the skin, a teasing counter that drew a tight sound from his throat. His grip shifted, one hand clamping her hip as he pressed her back, the walls chill seeping through her jacket, while his warmth flooded her front. The age gap sharpened the moment, a forbidden edge that fueled her defiance and his hunger. Their bodies locked in a silent, electric standoff. She tipped her head, lips parting, and Mark closed the gap, his mouth crashing into hers with a force that stole her breath. The kiss was fierce, tasting of salt and the faint bitterness of the bar's cheap whiskey. His stubble scraping her skin as his tongue sought hers. Sophie's hands roamed, wrestling with his belt, the leather slipping free with a soft thud that echoed in their corner. Her fingers ventured lower, tracing him through the denim, the heat and tension, there pulling a low groan from him that vibrated against her lips. His hand slid under her skirt, brushing the sensitive skin of her thigh, a bold move that sent a jolt through her, their mutual daring forging a bond that drowned out the stranger's distance they'd once kept. The bar's noise pressed in, Jake's distant laugh, the clatter of a glass, but it faded to a hum against the thudding in her ears. Mark's fingers tightened, pulling her closer, his kiss deepening as he pressed her harder against the wall, the brick biting into her shoulders. She matched him, her touch firm and searching, the denim rough under her palm as she drew another ragged sound from him. His hand climbed higher, grazing the heat between her legs, and her gasp broke the kiss, her head tipping back as the sensation rippled through her. The line between them, age, context, propriety, dissolved, replaced by a rhythm of need that pulsed in time with the bar's undercurrent. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his chest heaving, eyes dark with intent. Sophie's lips were swollen, her breath uneven, but she held his gaze, a spark of challenge still burning in her hazel eyes. His hand stayed on her thigh, a quiet claim, and she shifted, pressing into him, daring him to take more. The corner shielded them, a fragile bubble in the bar's chaos, but the weight of their actions hung heavy, thrilling, reckless, undeniable. Mark's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking as he wrestled with the pull. Then he leaned in again, his lips brushing her ear. "This isn't over," he said, the promise rough and low, threading through the haze as the night stretched taut around them. The bar's clamor faded as Sophie and Mark slipped from the shadowed corner, her hand gripping his, fingers slick with the heat of their earlier tangle. She led him through the crowd, past the clatter of glasses and the neon's buzz, toward the narrow hall where the bathrooms hid. The air shifted, damp tile, stale smoke, a faint sting of disinfectant cutting through the haze. The door swung shut, muffling the jukebox wail, and the small space closed in, a flickering fluorescent casting stark lines across Mark's rugged face. Sophie's pulse thrummed, her jacket slipping off one shoulder as she turned to him, hazel eyes blazing with defiance and need. He stepped forward, hands finding her hips, pulling her close, the heat radiating through her skirt, a stark promise against the cool tile beneath her boots. She pushed him into the nearest stall, the metal door clanging shut with a hollow ring that echoed in the tight space. The gritty floor pressed into her knees as she sank down, her fingers deftly working his jeans open, warm and alive under her touch. Mark's breath hitched, his hand hovering before threading through her tousled blonde hair, the strands catching on his rough skin as she leaned in. Her lips brushed him first, a feather light graze that drew a tight sound from his chest, then parted, enveloping him in a slow, deliberate heat that made his knees buckle. Her eyes flicked up, locking with his, a challenge woven into the tender surrender of the act. Her breath warm against him as she deepened the motion, tasting the salt and urgency of his skin. The stall amplified every sound, the slick rhythm of her movements, the low growl tearing from Mark's throat, the faint creak of his boots shifting on the tile. Sweat beaded on his neck, trickling down the column of his throat as he gripped her hair tighter. Restraint fraying with each soft hum she let slip, the vibration rippling through him like a current. The air thickened, heavy with the musk of their closeness, the salt of their skin mingling with the bar's lingering smoke. Sophie's hands braced his thighs, fingers digging into the denim as she steadied herself, her rhythm slow then quickening, drawing him deeper into the warmth of her mouth. His voice broke, a ragged rasp. Sophie, bouncing off the tile, a crack in his calm that fueled her, her tongue tracing him with a teasing pressure that sent heat pooling in his core. His control slipped, his hand tightening in her hair as he pulled her up, chest heaving, eyes dark with a hunger that matched hers. He pressed her against the stall wall, the metal cold through her shirt, a sharp contrast to the fire building between them. His lips crashed into hers, tasting the salt of himself on her tongue, the kiss deep and unyielding, his stubble grazing her skin as he claimed her mouth. "I need you, now," he rasped, the plea rough and urgent as he hoisted her up, her legs wrapping tight around his waist, the skirt bunching higher to bear the smooth expanse of her thighs, their bodies aligned, the friction igniting a storm that swept them both, and he pressed into her, a fierce, unrestrained move that drew a sharp gasp from her lips, her head tipping back against the wall as the sensation flooded her senses. The stall shook with their urgency, the metal rattling faintly as their sweat-slicked skin met in a desperate cadence. Sophie's nails raked his back through his shirt, leaving faint trails as she clung to him, her voice breaking into jagged cries of his name that mingled with his low groans. His hands gripped her hips, guiding her against him, the rhythm building. Slow at first, then fierce, each thrust defiance of the stranger's boundary they'd once held. Her legs tightened, pulling him closer, the heat of her skin against his, a velvet pressure that drove him deeper, their breaths sinking in short, ragged bursts. The age divide melted away, lost in the intoxicating dance of their union, every touch a claim, every sound a testament to the fire consuming them. Pleasure coiled tight, a slow burn that flared brighter with each movement, her body responding to his with a trembling intensity. Mark's grip hardened, one hand sliding up to cup her jaw, tilting her face to meet his gaze as he pressed deeper, the connection raw and unguarded. Her lips parted, a soft sound escaping, a gasp, a plea, as the crest neared, her fingers digging into his shoulders, anchoring her against the wave. He felt it too, the tension winding tight in his core, and he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling as the rhythm surged. She clenched around him, a shuddering release that ignited his own, the peak crashing through them in a shared, trembling rush, hot, overwhelming, leaving them breathless and entwined, the air thick with the echo of their union. They stilled, the fluorescent buzzing overhead, the bar's hum seeping back like a slow tide. Sophie's legs slid down, her boots unsteady on the tile, and Mark braced a hand against the wall, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Her skirt settled, wrinkled and askew, and she leaned into him, the warmth of his skin a lingering anchor. The weight of it settled, raw, indelible, a bond forged in the night's chaos. Neither spoke, the silence heavy but alive, their connection a visceral truth etched in the damp air, the faint marks on their skin, and the quiet thrum of their pulses slowing together. Morning light sliced through the blinds of Sophie's cramped apartment, a soft gray glow filtering over the tangled sheets where she and Mark lay. The city outside stirred awake, car horns bleating faintly, the low rumble of a delivery truck rattling the street below. But inside, the air hung still, heavy with the scent of last night's bar smoke and the musk of their skin. Sophie shifted, her blonde hair a messy sprawl across the pillow, her bare shoulder peeking from the blanket as she traced the edge of the fabric with a restless finger. Mark lay beside her, one arm flung across his chest, his rugged features softened in the dimness, stubble darker against his jaw after the night's chaos. They'd stumbled here after the bar, a blur of half-spoken words and urgent hands collapsing into her bed as the adrenaline faded. Now the quiet pressed in, and Sophie kept her eyes on the ceiling, the weight of their actions settling like dust in the room's corners. The mattress creaked as Mark stirred, his hand brushing her arm, a tentative tether that made her tense, then soften. He propped himself up, the sheets slipping to reveal the faint marks her nails had left on his shoulders, and his voice broke the hush, low and rough. "Last night, we good?" The question hung there, unguarded, and she felt a tug at the tangle of guilt and thrill knotted in her chest. She turned her head, meeting his gray gaze, and saw the same uncertainty mirrored there, a mechanic's steady hands unsteady now, searching her face. The bar's reckless heat felt distant, replaced by a fragile stillness, but the memory of his touch lingered, warm and vivid against her skin. Sophie nodded, a shy grin tugging at her lips as she pushed past the awkwardness. "Better than good. Round 2 later?" The tease slipped out, light but laced with truth, and his mouth curved, a rare softness breaking through his reserve. He didn't answer, just let his fingers linger on her arm, tracing a slow path that sent a quiet jolt through her. The apartment hummed with small sounds, the drip of a faucet, the faint buzz of her phone on the nightstand, anchoring them in the present. Sophie stretched, the sheet falling away to reveal the curve of her hip, and Mark's eyes followed, a flicker of hunger still smoldering beneath the calm. She felt it too, the pull that hadn't faded, but it sat alongside something new, a tenderness threading through the rawness, reshaping the strangers they'd been into something undefined. The age gap, the bar's dare, the stall's storm, all of it lingered in the air, a bond forged in defiance, now cooling into a question. Neither rushed to answer. He sat up fully, the mattress dipping, as he swung his legs over the side, his back to her, as he rubbed a hand over his face. Sophie watched the play of muscle under his skin, the quiet strength she'd felt pressed against her, and her fingers twitched, wanting to reach out, but holding back. The city's pulse grew louder outside, a siren wailing, footsteps echoing on the stairs, and it nudged them toward the day, toward whatever this was becoming. Mark glanced back, his expression unreadable but warm, and she caught the hint of a promise in it, a thread left dangling between retreat and return. They rose, moving through the morning in a tentative dance, coffee brewing, clothes gathered from the floor, each gesture a quiet negotiation of space. Sophie leaned against the counter, mug in hand, the steam curling up as she stole a look at him pulling on his jacket. The leather creaked, familiar now, and he met her eyes, a beat of silence stretching before he stepped closer. His hand brushed her cheek, brief but firm, and then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone, Sophie exhaled, the apartment settling around her, the night's fire simmering into something she could still feel in her bones, a connection unmade, yet unmistakably theirs.